Hi there, class. For this week, I wanted to create a very brief video to kind of outline some of the major concepts that I need you to get, and I want you to review this before you do the assignments. Remember, always use resources before trying assignments. Now, this week, you have a couple of chapters to get through. However, they're not very complex, but they do require your attention. The first thing I want to bring your attention to is showing on the screen. It's called the business cycle. Now, here's the thing. In this macroeconomics class, what you're doing is you're watching as the economy transitions and moves over time. And as it moves over time, changes in the real level of output will actually mean or have implications for what we do in terms of macroeconomic policy. Now, the phases of the business cycle are outlined here. Remember last week, you calculated the gross domestic product? What we're going to be doing this week is watching how it moves over time. Downturns in economic activity are pretty much referred to as recessions. We have lived through one of the worst recessions we've ever seen. It's called the Great Recession, which happened in 2008, 2007, related to the crash in the housing market within the United States. Right now, we're going through the Great Lockdown. And the Great Lockdown has a recession that's tied to it. Why? Downturns in economic activity, when the real level of output or GDP is dropping, that's what's called a recession. Now, a recession is very different from a depression. You've probably heard the word depression in the past, like the Great Depression of the 1930s. This is also called a trough. And it's different from a recession because a downturn in economic activity, a drop in the real level of output, is very different from a trough where the level of output bottoms out. It's at the minimum amount. Now, the other thing that we have, the other cycle, the other phase of the business cycle is an expansion. This is when we're digging ourselves out of a recession or a trough. And this is an upward movement in the real level of output, an expansion or a recovery. Now, once we are at the highest level of output possible, this is called a peak. Again, the phases of the business cycle, the recession, the trough or the depression, the expansion or the recovery, and then we have the peak. And in this course, we watch all of these phases to know what is the appropriate policy we should conduct. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at some of the measures, some of the instability that might actually exist as we move through these phases. And I'm going to do this quickly because I expect you to be reading your text. This is me introducing the topic to you. Let's start with the good news. Economic growth. As the name suggests, it's growth. This is an expansion in the productive capacity of society. Our current level, we're exceeding it. We're now hitting what was unattainable. I want to focus on how we calculate growth. There are two ways. We calculate economic growth by looking at changes or increases in the real GDP per capita. You know what GDP is. You know what real GDP is. GDP per capita is just the real GDP divided by the population. Watch how the real GDP per capita increases. That's economic growth. Another way to calculate economic growth is to just look at how the real GDP increases over time. So there are two ways. Increase in real GDP per capita or just an increase in the GDP. I'll show you what I mean. Let's do a simple, really simple example. Let's pretend as if our real GDP in 1 year is 400. Our real GDP in another year is 900. Let's also say in year 1, the population is 100. And let's pretend in year 2, the population is 150. One way to calculate economic growth is to look at the increase in the GDP per capita. You remember what that is? It's the GDP divided by the population. So if GDP in year 1 is 400 and the population in that same year is 100, the GDP per capita is 4. What about year 2? The GDP in that particular year was 900, but the population is 150. Then what is the real GDP per capita in year 3? It's 6. Now, how do we calculate economic growth? We look at the percentage change in real GDP per capita. So if we're moving from 4 to 6, what's the percentage increase? From 4 to 6. From 4 to 6. What's the percentage increase? Well, if you move from 4 to 6, you change by 2. 2 divided by 4. Our first method, the percentage change in GDP per capita is 2 divided by 4. That's 50%. Remember, there's another way to calculate economic growth. We just look at the change in the GDP, not the per capita. That's also another way. So we move from 400 to 900. We move from 400 to 900. So what's the percentage change? Well, we move from 400 to 900. So we change by 500. That divided by 400. In this example, it would be 125%. So economic growth, we have two ways.